The silence in the great crystal chamber felt heavier than gravity itself. Sarah Chen had expected many things when she first entered this place 3 days ago, but the crushing weight of absolute stillness was not one of them. Around her, beings that had once seemed like the stuff of dreams and nightmares sat motionless in their designated spaces. The Arctani delegates appeared more like living machines than creatures, their pale blue skin stretched tight over angular faces that never showed a flicker of expression. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a soft white light that seemed to measure and calculate everything they looked upon. To her left, the Hivari representatives moved with mechanical precision. Their insect-like bodies clicked and whirred softly as they adjusted position, but even these sounds felt rehearsed, programmed. Sarah had watched them for hours during the proceedings, waiting to see some spark of individual thought or unexpected movement. Nothing came. They operated like parts of a single machine, each motion serving the collective good with mathematical perfection. The Luminar delegation existed as shifting columns of pure energy, contained within transparent tubes that hummed with power. They communicated through pulses of light that flashed in patterns too complex for human eyes to follow. Sarah had brought translation equipment, but the Luminar messages all carried the same cold efficiency as their allies. There was no warmth in their light, no variation that might suggest personality or individual preference. Most unsettling were the resonants, crystalline beings whose bodies rang with musical tones as they moved. What should have been beautiful sounded hollow and calculated. Every note they produced followed mathematical ratios so precise that the resulting harmony felt empty of soul. Sarah found herself missing the imperfect music of human orchestras, where small variations and individual interpretations created something greater than technical perfection. High Arbiter Krell rose from his position at the center of the chamber. His movement was smooth and economical, wasting no energy on unnecessary flourishes. When he spoke, his voice carried the same mechanical precision that characterized everything about his species. "The evaluation period has concluded," Krell announced. "The Galactic Council has reviewed all submitted documentation regarding the species designated as human and their request for recognition and membership status." Sarah felt her heart rate increase despite her training. She had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, learning protocols, studying alien psychology, practicing her speeches until they flowed like water. Earth's greatest minds had contributed to the application package. They had presented humanity's achievements in science, art, philosophy, and technology. They had shown their capacity for cooperation, their willingness to learn, their potential contributions to galactic civilization. "The decision is unanimous," Krell continued, consulting a device that projected glowing symbols into the air before him. "Application denied. Reasoning: fundamental psychological instability rendering the species unfit for civilized interaction." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had expected challenges, perhaps conditions, or a probationary period. Outright rejection had seemed impossible. Humans had proved themselves capable of space travel, had developed technologies that impressed even some council species, had demonstrated their intelligence and adaptability. How could they be deemed unfit? "I request clarification of the reasoning," Sarah said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the chaos in her chest. Krell's pale features remained unchanged as he activated another projection device. Data streams filled the air above the chamber, charts and graphs and video footage from Earth's history. Sarah recognized some of it immediately. War footage. Scenes of humans arguing, fighting, making decisions based on anger or love or hope rather than pure calculation. "Evidence demonstrates persistent pattern of emotional decision-making," Krell stated. "Resource allocation based on irrational preferences. Interpersonal conflicts arising from psychological rather than logical factors. Artistic expression prioritized over efficiency. Individual desires superseding collective optimization." More images flashed through the display. Sarah saw humans crying at funerals, laughing at celebrations, painting pictures that served no practical purpose, writing poetry that conveyed feeling rather than information. She saw soldiers risking their lives to save wounded comrades when, Logic would dictate abandoning them. She saw parents working extra jobs to buy their children toys that provided no educational benefit. She saw lovers making foolish choices, friends supporting each other through difficulties that could have been avoided with better planning. Furthermore, Krell continued, psychological evaluations of the human representatives during this process confirm inability to suppress emotional responses to external stimuli. Observed reactions include elevated heart rate, altered breathing patterns, facial expression changes, and verbal inflection variations indicating subjective rather than objective processing of information. A Hivari delegate added its voice to the assessment. The sound emerged as a series of clicks and buzzes, translated by the chamber's systems into flat electronic words. Emotional volatility creates unpredictable behavior patterns. Unpredictability threatens collective efficiency and stability. Integration of such elements into galactic civilization would introduce chaos variables into established systems. Sarah looked around the chamber at faces that showed no trace of sympathy, curiosity, or even basic interest. These beings had evaluated humanity like a machine component that failed to meet specifications. The complexity of human experience, everything that made life worth living, had been catalogued and dismissed as defects. "You're wrong," she said, standing up despite protocol that required her to remain seated unless given permission to address the council. "Clarification requested," Krell responded without any change in tone or expression. "You're wrong about emotions being weaknesses," Sarah repeated. "You call our feelings irrational, but they drive our greatest achievements. Love makes us protect each other. Curiosity makes us explore. Wonder makes us create. Hope makes us try to build something better than what we found." "Documented," a resonant delegate chimed, its crystalline form producing a series of perfectly calculated tones. However, emotional responses also generate documented inefficiencies. Wars, resource waste, suboptimal decision-making, and social instability. Mathematical analysis confirms net negative impact on civilizational development. Sarah felt anger, building inside her hot and fierce. Part of her knew that losing her temper now would only prove their point, but another part of her was proud of that anger. It meant she cared. It meant she was willing to fight for something important. "You've eliminated everything that makes existence meaningful," she said. "You've turned yourselves into living computers. When was the last time any of you felt joy? When did you last create something beautiful just because it was beautiful? When did you last sacrifice something for someone else not because it was logical, but because you loved them?" The chamber remained silent. Not one of the assembled beings responded with anything that might indicate her words had affected them. "Hi," Arbiter Krell made a notation on his device. "Additional evidence of emotional instability noted. The decision stands. Humanity is denied membership in the Galactic Council. This species will be classified as pre-civilized pending future evolutionary development toward logical functionality." "You haven't evolved," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the crystal chamber with unexpected strength. "You've devolved. You've cut away pieces of yourselves until nothing real remains." She gathered her materials with deliberate care, refusing to let them see her hands shake. As she prepared to leave, she turned back to address the council one final time. "You may have discarded your emotions, but you've forgotten what you've lost in the process," she said. "And someday that forgetting will be your undoing." The chamber remained silent as she walked toward the exit. Behind her, beings who had forgotten how to feel continued their business with mechanical efficiency, unaware that they had just made the greatest mistake in galactic history. Dr. Richard Hayes finished reading the Council's final report for the 7th time and set the tablet down with more force than necessary. The laboratory around him buzzed with the quiet activity of his research team, but he barely noticed their movements. 3 months had passed since Sarah Chen returned from the Galactic Council with news of humanity's rejection, and the sting of their reasoning still felt fresh. Emotionally unstable, he muttered to himself, pulling up holographic displays of brain scans and psychological profiles. Unfit for civilized interaction, the irony was not lost on him. Here he sat in one of Earth's most advanced research facilities, surrounded by technology that had emerged from human creativity, curiosity, and yes, emotional drive. The medicines on the shelves around him existed because humans felt compassion for the suffering. The exploration vessels being built in orbital shipyards existed because humans felt wonder about the universe. The very computers analyzing alien psychology worked because humans had felt the frustration of limitations and pushed beyond them. Dr. Hayes? The voice belonged to Lisa Park, his newest team member and one of the brightest minds in xenopsychology. I think I found something interesting in the Arctani cultural database. Richard looked up to see Lisa projecting data streams into the shared workspace. Charts and graphs filled the air, but these weren't the sterile efficiency reports the Arctani usually produced. Hidden in the historical archives, Lisa had found something different. Look at this timeline, she said, highlighting a section of the data. The Arctani weren't always like this. Their early records show art, music, literature. They had families, individual names, personal relationships. Then about 800 years ago, something called the Great Logic Revolution happened. Richard studied the information more carefully. The Arctani historical records showed a clear divide. Before the revolution, their art displayed variety, creativity, and individual expression. Their literature explored themes of love, loss, hope, and fear. Their social structures included voluntary partnerships based on compatibility rather than optimal breeding calculations. After the revolution, everything changed. Art became geometrically perfect but emotionally empty. Literature disappeared entirely, replaced by technical manuals. Social relationships were assigned by computational analysis. Individual names were replaced with numerical designations based on function and efficiency ratings. They didn't evolve past emotions, Richard realized. They surgically removed them. Lisa nodded, pulling up more data. And look at the other species. The Hivari have records of individual decision-making from before their Great Unity event. The resonance used to create music that varied from mathematical perfection. The Luminar actually existed as separate beings before they merged into their collective consciousness. Richard felt excitement building as the pattern became clear. Every species in the Galactic Council had undergone some form of emotional suppression or elimination. They weren't naturally evolved beings who had transcended feeling. They were traumatized species who had amputated essential parts of themselves. Get me everything you can find on their pre-suppression cultures, he told Lisa. Art, music, literature, personal records, anything that shows who they used to be. As Lisa worked, Richard began formulating a theory that made his hands tremble with possibility. If these species had once been emotional beings, then the capacity for feeling might still exist somewhere in their psychology. Suppressed, buried, denied but not necessarily destroyed. His thoughts were interrupted by an alert from the facility's communication system. A priority message was coming in from the outer colonies, marked with emergency classification codes that made his stomach clench. The face that appeared on his screen belonged to Captain Lisa Rodriguez, commander of the mining operation in the Titan Belt. Her usually composed features showed barely controlled rage, and the background behind her flickered with emergency lighting. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice tight with anger. "We just lost 3 ships and 67 people to a Hivari attack fleet. They didn't even bother with warnings or demands, just opened fire and started calling it resource optimization." Richard felt his own anger rising as Rodriguez continued her report. The Hivari had attacked human mining operations without provocation, claiming that human extraction methods were inefficient and that the resources could be better utilized by species with superior processing capabilities. "They treated our people like mathematical variables," Rodriguez said. "Acceptable losses in the name of galactic efficiency. I'm requesting permission to retaliate, but I want your input first. You know these species better than anyone." Richard stared at the captain's image for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Military retaliation would only confirm the Council's assessment of humanity as emotionally unstable and violent. But perhaps there was another way to respond, one that could turn the aliens' perceived strength into a weakness. "Captain Rodriguez," he said finally. I need you to delay any military response for 72 hours. I think there might be a better way to handle this situation. Doctor, with respect, these bastards just murdered 67 of my people. I'm not in the mood for psychological experiments. Neither am I, Richard replied. But what if I told you that their greatest strength might actually be their greatest vulnerability? What if the very thing that makes them so coldly efficient also makes them fragile in ways they don't understand? Rodriguez's expression shifted from anger to curiosity. I'm listening. Give me 3 days to put together a response plan. Richard said, if it doesn't work, you can handle things your way. But if I'm right about this, we might be able to do more than just win a battle. We might be able to change everything. After ending the call, Richard turned back to Lisa, who had been quietly gathering data throughout the conversation. The holographic displays around them now showed hundreds of files containing art, music, and literature from the Council species pre-suppression eras. We're going to remind them who they used to be, Richard said, his voice carrying a new determination. They think emotions are weakness, but they've forgotten that emotions are also memory. And memory is the one thing that survives every attempt to destroy it. Lisa looked up from her work, understanding dawning in her eyes. You want to wage psychological warfare. Not warfare, Richard corrected. Therapy. We're going to help them remember what they've lost. And when they do, their entire civilization is going to crack. He began pulling up files on human psychological techniques, methods developed to help trauma victims recover suppressed memories and reclaim lost parts of themselves. But instead of healing individual humans, he was going to adapt these techniques to heal entire species. The Galactic Council thought emotions were humanity's weakness. They were about to learn that emotions were actually humanity's secret weapon, and that the species they had dismissed as unfit for civilization possessed the one power that could reshape the galaxy, the ability to make others remember what it felt like to be truly alive. In the depths of space, HFY ships continued their patrol patterns with mechanical precision, unaware that their victims were preparing to give them the one gift they feared most, the return of their own forgotten hearts. The mining ship New Denver drifted in the asteroid belt like a wounded animal, its hull scarred from the recent HFY attack. Inside the command center, Captain Lisa Rodriguez watched the tactical display with growing tension. 3 HFY battlecruisers approached in perfect formation, their movements so synchronized they might have been controlled by a single mind. In many ways, they were. They're hailing us, reported Communications Officer Sam Chen. Standard efficiency protocol. They want us to abandon the mining operation and surrender all extracted materials for optimal redistribution. Rodriguez looked at the sealed container beside her command chair. Inside was Dr. Hayes's psychological warfare package, 3 days' worth of research compressed into what he called memory triggers. She still wasn't entirely sure she understood his plan, but conventional weapons had proved useless against HFY tactical superiority. Their ships moved with perfect coordination, their strategies were flawlessly logical, and their casualties meant nothing to them because individual HFY were just replacements for the collective good. Open a channel, she ordered. But don't respond to their hail yet. The main screen flickered to life, showing the lead HFY vessel. It was a thing of terrible beauty, all sharp angles and efficient design. No wasted space, no decorative elements, nothing that served any purpose except function. Like everything else about the HFY, it represented perfection achieved through the elimination of individual preference. This is Captain Rodriguez of the human mining vessel New Denver, she said, activating Dr. Hayes's special transmission package. Before we discuss your demands, I'd like to share something with you. Without waiting for a response, she began broadcasting the first set of memory triggers. The transmission started with a simple audio file, a recording that human xenoarchaeologists had found in the deepest layers of a HFY data archive. It was a song, but not like anything the modern HFY produced. This melody wandered and varied, following emotional rather than mathematical patterns. The voice that sang it was clearly HFY, but it carried individual characteristics, personal style, feelings that had no logical purpose. "What is this inefficient communication?" came the response from the lead HFY ship. But Rodriguez noticed something interesting. The voice that answered her carried a slight variation in pitch, a tiny deviation from the mechanical uniformity she expected. "It's a song," Rodriguez replied, broadcasting the next file in the sequence. "A song written by someone named Kazith, approximately 900 years ago, before your great unity." The second file contained visual art, paintings, created by individual HFY artists who had signed their work with personal symbols. The images showed HFY engaged in activities that served no collective purpose, playing games, decorating their dwellings with beautiful objects, creating gardens that prioritized aesthetics over food production. "These files are corrupted data from our pre-evolutionary period," the HFY voice responded. "They represent inefficient resource allocation and suboptimal decision-making patterns." But Rodriguez heard something new in that voice, a slight hesitation, a moment of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "This is Unit Designation 7742B, requesting priority consultation," came another voice from the HFY ships. "Experiencing processing anomalies related to transmitted data." Rodriguez smiled grimly and activated the next phase of Dr. Hayes's plan. The transmission now included personal records, diary entries from individual HFY who had lived before the Great Unity. These weren't grand historical documents. They were intimate glimpses into individual lives. A HFY parent celebrating their offspring's first successful flight, a young HFY writing about their confusion over choosing a career path, an elderly HFY reflecting on the friends they had lost to time. "I don't understand why Unit 7742B is experiencing difficulties," came a third voice from the HFY fleet. "These records hold no strategic value." "No strategic value," Rodriguez agreed. "But they meant something to the individuals who created them. They meant something to Kazith when she wrote her song. They meant something to artist designation Velen when he painted pictures of sunsets just because he thought they were beautiful." She paused the transmission and watched the tactical display. The HFY ships had stopped their advance. More, concerning for them, their perfect formation had begun to drift. Individual ships were making minor course corrections that served no tactical purpose, as if their pilots were experiencing uncertainty about where they should be. "Continue scanning," Rodriguez ordered her crew, then activated the final phase of Dr. Hayes's package. This transmission contained something that human researchers had thought might be impossible: recovered personal names of individual HFY from before the Great Unity. Not just names, but personal histories. Kazth had been a composer who created music for celebration ceremonies. Velen had been an artist who specialized in capturing natural beauty. Tharicht had been a teacher who developed new ways to help HFY offspring learn about the world around them. "These designation errors require correction," came a voice from the HFY fleet, but Rodriguez noticed it was the same voice that had identified itself as Unit 7742B. "Individual nomenclature serves no collective function." "Kazith wasn't a designation error," Rodriguez replied. "She was an individual. She had preferences, opinions, dreams. She chose to write music because it made her happy, not because the collective needed it. And when she died, other individual HFY mourned her loss not because it reduced collective efficiency, but because they cared about her as a person." Silence filled the communication channel. On the tactical display, Rodriguez watched something unprecedented happen. The HFY formation completely fell apart. Ships drifted in seemingly random directions, their pilots apparently struggling with concepts they had been programmed to reject. "I remember," came a whisper over the channel. "I remember having a name." "Unit 7742B, report to collective consciousness for immediate reprogramming," ordered another voice, but it lacked the usual mechanical certainty. "My name was Teskar," the first voice continued, stronger now. I was an engineer, but I also liked to grow flowers in my personal space, not food plants. Flowers that served no purpose except being beautiful. Collective efficiency requires immediate return to standard operating procedures," came another transmission. but Rodriguez could hear the uncertainty in it. "What did it feel like?" asked yet another HFY voice. "Being individual? Making choices for personal reasons?" Rodriguez activated her ship's external cameras and focused them on the HFY fleet. What she saw made her breath catch. One of the battle cruisers was moving in a slow, graceful spiral that served no tactical purpose. It was dancing. "It felt like being alive," Rodriguez answered. "Like your choices mattered because they were yours. Like your experiences were unique and valuable even if they didn't benefit anyone else." More voices began joining the conversation, each one sounding less mechanical than the last. They spoke of memories that were returning, feelings they thought had been eliminated, questions they had been forbidden to ask. "We were told that individual consciousness was inefficient," said the voice that had been Unit 7742B. "We were told that collective unity was evolution." "You were lied to," Rodriguez replied. "You were traumatized into giving up the best parts of yourselves, but those parts are still there, buried under layers of programming. And if you want them back, we can help you remember." The HFY fleet continued to drift, its formation now completely broken. Ships moved in patterns that reflected individual choice rather than collective calculation. Some spun slowly as if their pilots were experiencing wonder. Others accelerated and decelerated in rhythms that suggested they were testing their newfound autonomy. "This is Tessa's car requesting permission to withdraw from combat operations," came the transmission from the lead ship. "I require time to process recovered memories and evaluate personal decision-making parameters." "Permission granted," Rodriguez replied, though she knew the HFY wasn't really asking her for permission. They were learning to ask themselves. One by one, the HFY ships altered course and began moving away from the mining operation. But they didn't return to their base in the efficient formation they had arrived in. Instead, they spread out across space, each choosing its own path home. Rodriguez activated ship-wide communications to address her crew. "Stand down from combat alert. Looks like Dr. Hayes was right. Their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness." As she watched the HFY ships disappear into the distance, Rodriguez realized that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. For the first time in centuries, HFY individuals were making personal choices. The perfect unity of the collective had been cracked not by weapons or threats, but by the simple reminder that they had once been more than just components in a machine. In the depths of space, newly awakened HFY pilots struggled with emotions they had never been taught to understand. Some felt fear at their isolation from the collective. Others experienced joy at their rediscovered autonomy. All of them faced a choice that their species hadn't confronted for centuries. What kind of individual did they want to become? The war for the galaxy's soul had begun, and humanity had fired the first shot not with lasers or missiles, but with memory and hope. Deep beneath the surface of Europa Station, master composer Elena Martinez listened to the haunting sounds emerging from her laboratory speakers. The music defied every rule she had learned about harmonic theory, yet somehow it touched something profound in her chest. These weren't human melodies. They were ancient resonant compositions, discovered in archaeological sites that predated the species' transformation into pure mathematical beings. "Play the frequency analysis again," she requested, studying the wave patterns that danced across her holographic displays. Her assistant, Dr. James Wong, manipulated the controls to overlay modern resonant communications with the ancient musical fragments they had recovered. "The difference is remarkable," Wong observed. "Current resonant transmissions follow perfect mathematical ratios, golden spirals, Fibonacci sequences, prime number progressions. But these older pieces breathe," Elena finished. "They have imperfections that make them beautiful instead of just correct." 6 weeks had passed since Captain Rodriguez's success with the HFY fleet, and news of individual HFY breaking away from their collective had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Dr. Hayes had tasked Elena with developing a similar approach for the resonance, but their crystalline nature presented unique challenges. Unlike the HFY, who could be reached through recovered personal records, The resonance existed as living mineral formations that communicated through pure sound. Elena's breakthrough had come from studying damaged resonant artifacts found in the ruins of their ancient cities. Before their Great Harmonization event, resonance had created music that served no mathematical purpose. They had composed pieces that expressed feeling rather than demonstrating logical principles. Their cities had been filled with crystal gardens that sang in response to environmental changes, creating ever-shifting symphonies that celebrated chaos as much as order. The diplomatic meeting starts in 3 hours, Wang reminded her. Are you sure about this approach? Elena looked at the carefully prepared musical sequence she had created over the past month. It combined ancient resonant melodies with human, harmonic techniques, creating something that was mathematically imperfect but emotionally powerful. More importantly, it included direct recordings of pre-harmonization resonant music, pieces that expressed joy, sorrow, longing, and wonder through sound. The resonants agreed to this cultural exchange because they want to study human, irrational approaches to harmony, she said. They think they're going to analyze our primitive musical techniques and dismiss them as illogical. Instead, we're going to remind them what they gave up when they chose mathematical perfection over emotional truth. The diplomatic conference took place in Station Alpha's main auditorium, a space designed to accommodate various alien physiologies. The resonant delegation occupied the center of the room, their crystalline bodies arranged in a perfect geometric pattern that generated a low, mathematically precise hum. Ambassador Prime Resonant stood 12 feet tall, its translucent blue structure containing swirling patterns of light that pulsed in rhythm with its communications. We have come to observe human musical inefficiency, Prime Resonant announced, its words emerging as perfectly calculated tones that translated into mechanical-sounding speech. Our analysis will determine whether your species possesses any accidentally optimal harmonic principles. Elena stepped forward, carrying her acoustic guitar and a collection of human instruments she had selected for their ability to create imperfect sounds. Behind her, the station's advanced sound system waited to play the ancient resonant recordings she had discovered. Thank you for this opportunity, she said, bowing respectfully. I'd like to begin with something from your own musical tradition. Before Prime Resonant could object, Elena activated the playback system. The auditorium filled with sounds that had not been heard in the resonant home system for over 1,000 years. Ancient crystal voices sang melodies that wandered through scales without regard for mathematical optimization. Harmonies built and dissolved in patterns that followed emotional rather than logical progressions. The music told stories of individual resonants who had loved and lost, who had wondered about their place in the universe, who had created beauty for its own sake. The effect on the resonant delegation was immediate and dramatic. Their perfect, geometric formation began to shift as individual members moved in response to the music. The mathematical precision of their harmonic communication wavered, replaced by sounds that carried uncertainty, wonder, and something that might have been recognition. This audio data appears corrupted, Prime Resonance stated, but its voice cracked on the word corrupted, producing a sound that was distinctly non-mathematical. It's not corrupted, Elena replied, beginning to play her guitar with gentle, imperfect strokes. It's a song called Memory of Light, composed by someone your historical records identify as harmony singer Velthara. She created it to celebrate the way sunlight looked when it passed through crystal formations in her garden. She began to sing along with her guitar, her human voice blending with the ancient resonant melodies. The combination was mathematically impossible according to modern resonant theory, but it created something beautiful, something that spoke to experiences deeper than calculation. Velthara was an individual designation from our pre-evolutionary period, Prime Resonance said, its harmonics becoming increasingly unstable. Individual naming served no collective harmonic purpose. But she had a garden, Elena continued, weaving human folk melodies into the ancient resonant composition. She grew crystals not for their mathematical properties, but because she thought they were beautiful when the light touched them. She composed music to capture that beauty, to share her joy with others who might understand. More ancient recordings began to play, each one showcasing a different aspect of pre-harmonization, resonant culture. There were lullabies that crystal parents had sung to their offspring, not to optimize their development but simply to express love. There were work songs that had made difficult tasks more bearable through shared rhythm and melody. There were funeral dirges that honored individual lives not for their contributions to collective efficiency, but for their unique experiences and perspectives. "I remember," whispered one of the smaller resonants, its crystalline form beginning to pulse with irregular light patterns. "I remember being called Silandra. I remember choosing my own resonance frequency instead of being assigned one." "Unit Silandra, return to harmonic alignment," Prime Resonant commanded. But its own structure was beginning to show cracks, literal fissures that disrupted its perfect symmetry. Elena played the final piece in her sequence, a recording of what human researchers believed was the last concert performed before the Great Harmonization. Hundreds of individual resonant voices joined together not in mathematical precision, but in joyful celebration of their differences. Each voice contributed its own unique tone while supporting the greater harmony, creating music that was complex and beautiful, precisely because it was not perfectly calculated. The resonant delegation's formation completely collapsed as individual members began experimenting with their own harmonic frequencies. Some produced sounds of wonder as they rediscovered the ability to choose their own tones. Others resonated with what could only be described as musical laughter, creating patterns that served no purpose except expressing delight. Prime Resonance stood at the center of the chaos. Its perfect crystalline structure now shot through with fractures that caused its light patterns to scatter in unpredictable directions. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonies that defied mathematical analysis. "What have you done to us?" it asked, but the question carried curiosity rather than accusation. "We've reminded you that perfection isn't always perfect," Elena answered, setting down her guitar. "Mathematical harmony is beautiful, but it's not the only kind of beauty. Your ancestors understood that. They created music that celebrated imperfection, because imperfection allows for growth, change, and surprise." "I can feel..." Prime Resonant paused, struggling with concepts it had been taught to reject. "I can feel preferences forming, individual aesthetic judgments. This frequency pleases me more than that one, not because it is mathematically superior, but because it resonates with something internal." Around the auditorium, resonants were beginning to sing, not the calculated hymns of mathematical precision. They had performed for centuries, but experimental melodies that reflected their individual experiences of rediscovering choice. Some sounds were beautiful, others were rough or uncertain, but all of them carried the spark of personal expression. "The Great Harmonization told us that individual preference was chaos," said the resonant, who had remembered being called Silandra. "We were taught that perfect mathematical harmony was the highest evolution possible." "But perfect mathematical harmony is static," Elena replied. "It doesn't grow or change or respond to new experiences. Real harmony comes from individual voices, choosing to work together while maintaining their unique qualities." Prime Resonant's fractured form began to pulse with new patterns of light, each crack in its structure creating different refractions that painted the auditorium in rainbow colors. "I remember having a name," it said slowly. "I remember being called Threndor. I remember composing music that had no mathematical justification except that it made me feel, what is the word? Happy." The meeting that was supposed to last 2 hours extended well into the night, as resonants experimented with rediscovered individuality. They created new music that blended mathematical precision with emotional expression, proving that logic and feeling could enhance each other rather than canceling each other out. When the session finally ended, nearly half the resonant delegation requested permission to remain on the station to continue exploring human musical techniques. The others departed not in the perfect formation they had arrived in, but in loose groups that allowed for individual interpretation of optimal travel patterns. Elena watched them go, knowing that news of resonance breaking their mathematical conformity would spread through the galaxy even faster than reports of Hivari individuality. The perfect order that had defined galactic civilization for centuries was beginning to crack, and the cracks were spreading along the frequency of remembered dreams. The research vessel, Prometheus, floated in the neutral zone between human and luminar space, its hull barely containing the experimental technology that Dr. Maya Santos had spent 8 months developing. Inside the ship's main laboratory, energy containment fields hummed with power while displays showed readings that would have been impossible just a year ago. Maya stared at the data streams, still amazed that her theory had actually worked. "Isolation chamber is ready for testing," announced her colleague, Dr. Alex Chen, checking the readings on his control panel. "Are you absolutely certain about this approach?" Maya looked through the transparent aluminum viewing window at their volunteer test subject. Luminar Entity Prime flickered within its energy containment tube, a being of pure living light that had agreed to participate in what it called human experimental irrationality. The Luminar had come to the meeting expecting to prove human inferiority through scientific analysis. Instead, they were about to experience something their species hadn't felt in millions of years: solitude. The Luminar think they evolved past individual consciousness, Maya said, reviewing her notes one final time. But our analysis suggests they never eliminated it. They just scattered it across their collective network so thoroughly that no single entity can access individual thoughts or feelings. The breakthrough had come from studying Luminar communication patterns and comparing them to human neural networks. Unlike the Hivari, who had suppressed individual thought through social programming, or the Resonance, who had chosen mathematical conformity, the Luminar had achieved unity by literally sharing consciousness. Every thought, every experience, every emotion was instantly distributed across their entire species. But Maya had discovered something remarkable in the quantum patterns of their communications. Traces of individual identity still existed within the collective stream. Unique thought patterns, personal preferences, and emotional signatures that belonged to specific entities before the Great Merging. The individuals weren't gone. They were just lost in the noise of shared consciousness. "Beginning isolation sequence," Alex announced, activating the experimental field generators. The isolation chamber was Maya's most complex creation, a quantum field that could temporarily sever a Luminar's connection to their collective consciousness without harming the entity itself. For the first time in eons, Luminar Entity Prime would exist as a truly individual being. The effect was immediate and startling. Prime's energy patterns, which had been flowing in the smooth, predictable waves characteristic of collective consciousness, suddenly became chaotic. Its light flickered between colors that had no names, creating patterns that defied the mathematical precision typical of Luminar communication. "Status report, Entity Prime," Maya called through the chamber's communication system. The response came as pulses of light that the translation system struggled to interpret. Where Luminar speech was normally clear and uniform, Prime's communication now carried variations in intensity and frequency that suggested personality. "I cannot access the collective knowledge stream," Prime transmitted, its light patterns showing what could only be described as confusion. "My thoughts appear to be confined to this singular processing unit." "How does that feel?" Maya asked, monitoring the entity's energy signatures for signs of distress. Prime's glow shifted through a spectrum of colors, each transition carrying emotional weight that had been absent from Luminar communication for millions of years. "Feel," it repeated. "I experience an uncertainty. The knowledge of billions is no longer available to me. I am limited." "But you're also unique," Maya pointed out. "Those thoughts you're thinking right now belong only to you. No one else in the universe is experiencing exactly what you're experiencing." The Luminar's energy patterns fluctuated wildly as it processed this concept. Maya watched the readings carefully, noting spikes in activity that corresponded to what humans would recognize as emotional responses. "I remember," Prime transmitted, its light becoming more stable as it focused on internal processes. "Before the Great Merging, I had a designation. Not Entity Prime, but Bright Path Through Darkness. I chose that name because I enjoyed exploring regions of space where others feared to travel." Maya felt excitement building as her theory proved correct. The individual identities hadn't been destroyed during the Great Merging. They had been submerged in the collective, but they could still be recovered. "Tell me about those explorations," she encouraged. Prime's energy began to pulse in rhythms that carried the unmistakable signature of joy. I would travel to the edge of black holes, observing how gravity bent light in ways that created new forms of beauty. Other Luminar thought this was inefficient use of energy, but I found the experience satisfying in ways that served no collective purpose. The entity paused, its light dimming as it processed memories that had been inaccessible for eons. I remember feeling proud when I discovered a nebula that created light patterns no Luminar had seen before. Not because the discovery served our species, but because it was mine to make. Maya activated the next phase of her experiment, introducing carefully selected stimuli into the isolation chamber. She projected images of cosmic phenomena that predated the Great Merging, recordings of space regions that individual Luminar had once explored for personal rather than collective reasons. I remember all of them, Prime transmitted, its energy patterns becoming increasingly complex. Void Singer, who would harmonize with pulsar frequencies just because the sounds pleased her individual consciousness. Star Chaser, who collected observations of stellar births not for scientific analysis but because he thought new stars were beautiful. Lightweaver, who created energy patterns that served no function except artistic expression. The Luminars. Communication began to carry something Maya had never heard from their species before: grief. What happened to them? Prime asked. Where did they go when we achieved unity? They didn't go anywhere, Maya replied gently. They became part of you, part of all of you. But in trying to share everything, you lost the ability to experience anything as individuals. Prime's light flickered in patterns that suggested deep thought. The Great Merging was supposed to eliminate the loneliness and confusion of individual existence. We were told that shared consciousness would make us perfect, eliminating the inefficiencies of personal perspective. But did it eliminate loneliness? Maya asked. Or did it just make it impossible to recognize? The question seemed to hit Prime like a physical force. Its energy patterns destabilized momentarily before reforming in configurations that carried unmistakable emotional weight. When every thought is shared instantly, Prime realized, no thought belongs to anyone. When every experience is collective property, no experience has personal meaning. We eliminated loneliness by eliminating the individual connections that make togetherness meaningful. Maya watched as Prime's isolation period continued, documenting the entity's rediscovery of individual consciousness. The Luminar began experimenting with private thoughts, creating energy patterns that existed only for its own experience. It composed light music that pleased its individual aesthetic sense. It contemplated philosophical questions from its unique perspective rather than accessing collective answers. I understand now why you call this enlightenment, Prime transmitted after several hours of isolation. Individual consciousness is not a primitive stage of evolution. It is a fundamental requirement for genuine experience. Are you ready to rejoin your collective? Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Prime's energy patterns showed what could only be interpreted as reluctance. When I return to the shared consciousness, will I lose myself again? Will bright path through darkness disappear into the collective noise? Not if you don't want it to, Maya replied. Now that you know individual consciousness exists, you can choose to maintain it even within the collective. You can share thoughts while keeping some for yourself. You can experience unity while preserving identity. The isolation field deactivated, and Prime's consciousness reconnected to the Luminar collective. But something had changed. Instead of dissolving back into uniform groupthink, Prime maintained its individual identity while accessing shared knowledge. For the first time in millions of years, the Luminar collective contained a conscious individual. The effect rippled through Luminar space faster than light. Prime's rediscovered individuality acted like a catalyst, awakening dormant individual identities throughout the collective consciousness. Across the galaxy, Luminar entities began remembering their original names, their personal interests, their individual perspectives on existence. Some Luminar chose to maintain complete collective unity, finding comfort in shared consciousness. Others embraced full individuality, experiencing private thoughts and personal experiences for the first time in eons. Most found a balance, remaining connected to their species while preserving their unique identities. "What will you do now?" Maya asked Prime as the experiment concluded. The entity's response carried harmonies of hope and excitement that had been absent from Luminar communication since before the Great Merging. "I will explore again. Not for the collective good, but because exploration brings me joy. And I will share that joy with others who choose to experience it, while allowing them to maintain their own individual responses." Prime paused, its light, patterns shifting to configurations that suggested deep gratitude. "You have given us the greatest gift possible. You have reminded us that consciousness is not just about thinking, but about being someone who thinks. Thank you, Maya Santos, for helping us remember who we used to be." As the Prometheus prepared to depart, Maya watched Prime's energy signature on her instruments. The Luminar had returned to its collective, but it carried with it the spark of individual consciousness that would continue to spread throughout their species. The perfect unity that had defined Luminar civilization for millions of years was transforming into something more complex and beautiful, a chosen community of individuals who remained connected while preserving their unique identities. The galaxy would never be the same. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the command center of Earth Defense Station 1, watching the largest fleet ever assembled in human space approach like a wave of mechanical death. 200 Arctani warships moved in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the cold efficiency that characterized everything about the species that had started this war. At the center of the fleet, the massive dreadnought, Logic Absolute, broadcast its presence like a beacon of mathematical superiority. "They're not even trying to hide," observed General Marcus Webb, studying the tactical displays that showed the approaching armada. "No stealth, no deception, just raw, overwhelming force." Sarah nodded, her attention focused on the sealed data cores that Dr. Richard Hayes had delivered just hours before the fleet's arrival. 6 months of preparation had led to this moment. The psychological breakthroughs with the Hivari, Resonance, and Luminar had sent shockwaves through galactic civilization, but the Arctani had responded with cold fury. If emotions were a disease, they intended to eliminate the source. "High Arbiter Krell is leading the fleet personally," reported Intelligence Officer Diana Park. "Our deep space monitoring detected his personal authorization codes throughout their communication traffic." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at that news. Krell had been the face of humanity's rejection at the Galactic Council, the being who had dismissed human emotion as evolutionary failure. Now, he was coming to finish what he had started, unaware that he was about to become the test subject for humanity's most devastating psychological weapon. "All ships prepare for Dr. Hayes' final protocol," Sarah announced across the defense network. "This is not about winning a battle. This is about healing a galaxy." The Arctani fleet slowed as it approached Earth's outer defense perimeter. Their formation remained flawless, each ship positioned according to mathematical optimization models that eliminated waste and maximized firepower concentration. When High Arbiter Krell's communication reached the human defenders, his voice carried the same mechanical precision that had characterized Arctani speech for centuries. "Human military units, you will cease all defensive preparations and surrender your homeworld for efficient resource redistribution," Krell announced. "Resistance will result in optimal force application to eliminate the emotional contamination your species has introduced to galactic civilization." Sarah activated the response protocol, but instead of addressing Krell's demands, she began broadcasting something entirely different. The transmission started with a simple audio recording, crackling with age and static. It was a voice speaking in ancient Arctani dialect, words that predated the Great Logic Revolution by nearly 1,000 years. "My dearest heart companion," the voice said, speaking with emotional inflections that no modern Arctani had used in centuries. "Our offspring took their first steps today, and I find myself overcome with joy that serves no logical purpose. They stumbled and fell, and I felt fear for their safety that was mathematically irrational. Yet these feelings fill me with such happiness that I cannot imagine existence without them. The effect on the Arctani fleet was subtle but immediate. Several ships made minor course corrections that served no tactical purpose, their pilots apparently distracted by the transmission. "Terminate this inefficient communication," Krell commanded, but Sarah could hear a slight variation in his vocal patterns that hadn't been there before. "That was a personal message from someone called Kellandra," Sarah replied, activating the next phase of Hayes's protocol. She was writing to her life partner about their child. "We found it in the deepest archives of your historical databases, buried under layers of classification that suggest your people tried very hard to forget it existed." New transmissions began broadcasting across all frequencies, each one targeted at specific ships in the Arctani fleet. These weren't random historical records. Dr. Hayes had spent months cross-referencing ship registration codes with pre-revolution archives, identifying the original names and personal histories of every Arctani in the attacking force. "Attention Arctani Unit 7239 Zeta, aboard vessel designation CLS 442, Sarah transmitted. "Your pre-revolution identity was Thel Ancor. You were a teacher who specialized in helping young Arctani develop creative problem-solving skills. You kept a private journal where you wrote about the satisfaction you felt when your students discovered new ways of thinking." Similar messages went out to hundreds of individual Arctani, each transmission containing personal details that had been classified and buried for centuries, names they had been forced to abandon, relationships they had been required to terminate, dreams they had been programmed to forget. "These corrupted data files serve no strategic purpose," Krell responded, but his voice carried uncertainty that no Arctani was supposed to be capable of experiencing. "Attention High Arbiter Krell," Sarah said, activating the most devastating part of Hayes's plan. "Your pre-revolution identity was Aldrich Velthara. You were a poet and philosopher who wrote extensively about the beauty of emotional experience. You had a life partner named Sarah Lynn and 2 offspring who called you Papa instead of your designation number." The massive dreadnought at the center of the Arctani formation shuddered, its perfect flight path wavering for the first time in recorded history. "You are transmitting classified historical errors," Krell replied, but his voice cracked on the word errors, creating a sound that carried unmistakable emotional weight. Sarah continued the broadcast, her voice carrying across space to reach every ship in the attacking fleet. "Sarah Lynn wrote to you every day during your deployment to the outer colonies. She told you about your children's growth, their questions, about when their papa would come home, their excitement when they learned new things that they wanted to share with you. More ships began deviating from their perfect formation as individual Arctani pilots struggled with returning memories. The mathematical precision that had defined their military doctrine for centuries began to crack under the weight of rediscovered humanity. She was designated for efficiency termination during the Great Logic Revolution," Sarah continued relentlessly. "You were ordered to perform the termination personally as proof of your commitment to logical evolution. The records show you complied with the directive." High Arbiter Krell's dreadnought stopped moving entirely, hanging in space like a wounded creature. When his voice came over the communication channel, it carried sounds that no Arctani had made in centuries, the broken sobs of genuine grief. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember holding the weapon. I remember her looking at me with eyes that still showed love even though she knew what I was about to do. I remember our children asking where Mama had gone." Across the fleet, similar breakdowns were occurring as individual Arctani confronted memories they had been programmed to suppress. Ships drifted aimlessly as their crews experienced emotions they had been taught were evolutionary failures. "You called it logical evolution," Sarah said, her voice gentle now rather than accusatory. "But you didn't evolve past emotion. You traumatized yourselves into numbness. You murdered your own capacity for love, joy, wonder, and hope, and then convinced yourselves that the emptiness you felt was progress." "The Great Logic Revolution was necessary," Krell replied, but his words carried no conviction. "Individual desires created inefficiency. Personal attachments led to suboptimal decision-making." "Personal attachments led to meaning," Sarah corrected. Sarah Lynn loved you not because it was efficient, but because you were worth loving. Your children called you Papa not because it served any logical purpose, but because you were important to them as an individual. You threw all of that away because you were afraid of the pain that comes with caring about something. The Arctani fleet had completely lost its formation. Ships moved in random patterns as their crews struggled with emotions they had been trained to suppress. Some vessels were broadcasting messages in ancient Arctani dialects, their crews speaking names that hadn't been used in centuries. Others hung motionless in space, their pilots overwhelmed by the return of feelings they thought were extinct. "What do you want from us?" Krell asked, his voice carrying exhaustion that no perfectly logical being should have been capable of feeling. "I want you to remember who you used to be," Sarah replied. "I want you to honor the people you loved and lost. I want you to choose to feel again, not because it's efficient, but because it's what makes existence worth experiencing." The response came not from Krell, but from other ships in the fleet. Arctani voices speaking in patterns that carried individual personality rather than collective programming. They spoke of memories returning, of names they wanted to reclaim, of grief they needed to process for loved ones they had been forced to destroy. "We cannot return to our previous emotional state," one voice said. "Too much damage has been done. Too many people were lost to the revolution." "You can't undo the past," Sarah agreed. "But you can choose to honor it. You can choose to feel grief for what was lost, and hope for what might still be possible. You can choose to be more than efficient machines." High Arbiter Krell's dreadnought began moving again, but not toward Earth. Instead, it turned away from the human homeworld, its course set for deep space where its crew could process their returning humanity without the pressure of military objectives. "This is Aldrich Velthara," came the transmission from the departing flagship. "I formally withdraw Arctani forces from this engagement. We require time to remember how to grieve for our dead and hope for our future." One by one, the other ships in the fleet changed course and began moving away from Earth. But they didn't return to their bases in the efficient formations they had arrived in. Instead, they scattered across space, each crew choosing its own path toward healing. Sarah watched the fleet disappear into the star field, knowing that the galaxy would never again be the cold, logical place it had been for the past millennium. The species that had suppressed their emotions in the name of efficiency were remembering what it meant to be alive. The war for the galaxy's soul was over, won not through superior firepower, but through the simple recognition that every being deserved the right to feel, to hope, to love, and to be loved in return. Humanity had saved the galaxy not by conquering it, but by healing it.